Hi students, today we are focusing on the topic of continental drift, and we're looking specifically for evidence that helps prove that this is something that really happens and has happened in the past. So we're going to start off by answering this question of what continental drift theory is, and basically this picture kind of sums it up. It's a theory that the continents have drifted to their present-day locations over millions of years through forces beneath the Earth's crust. So you guys are all probably familiar with the word Pangea, and it's this idea that over time, somehow the continents broke apart and became what it is today. So how does this actually work? And how do we know it actually worked is the big question. So the first person that really coined the term for the continental drift theory was this guy named Alfred Wegener. He was a meteorologist, and he came up with this hypothesis of continental drift back in 1911. And he had several lines of evidence, and let's take a look at what kinds of evidence he had to try to prove his hypothesis. So the first thing that he looked at was just by mere observation of the shape of the continents. As you guys probably have already noticed from looking at a map by yourself and also working with the simulation earlier in step one, the shape of the continents kind of look like a jigsaw puzzle, and they kind of fit very well together, especially one of the most famous examples is South America and Africa. They tend to fit really well. This area right here tends to fit very well. So that's the first line of evidence, was just through mere observation of the shape of the continents. The second piece of evidence that Wegener had was the fact that there were similar rocks and mountains on different continents. So from research analysis of various rock samples and mountain characteristics and mountain samples across different continents, and you can see in this map, Wegener found that there was evidence enough to prove that these continents were perhaps once connected. So here you can see North America, Africa, and Europe kind of sharing mountain belts, and also from dating these mountain belts, we can find that they were really close in age. So that's another piece of evidence that Wegener tried to propose. A third piece of evidence for Wegener's theory was glacial evidence. So, as you guys know, glaciers are humongous mountains of ice, and over time we have had different glaciers form and melt and also move around. And when glaciers move around on continents, they slide, and when they do, they move, they leave these marks called striations on the continents. And when we study glacial striations on various continents in South America, Africa, India, and Antarctica, there is evidence to suggest that there may have been a glacier, an ice sheet that was on top of all of these continents, and it was evidence that they perhaps were once connected because they are so far apart today. How is it possible that they all have similar striations? And so this was another piece of evidence that Wegener had to try to prove that continental drift really happened and that the continents were once connected. Um, One more piece of evidence that Wegener tried to propose, very strong evidence, was fossil evidence. And so there were several records of different types of fossils that were found in different continents. Um, and that was evidence proposing or suggesting that these continents must have been connected at some point. Otherwise, how in the world would some of these creatures be part of all these continents? A really important example that you guys may have noticed from the collaborative station activity was this Glossopteris, which is a type of plant, and they were found across Australia, Antarctica, India, Africa, and South America. And the question is, if how is it possible that these plants are found in all the continents 300 million years ago, um, when they're really far apart today across oceans. Same with the Mesosaurus. We find them in both Africa and South America, and it's very unlikely that they have swam across miles and miles of ocean to get to the other side of the world. And so it's evidence that it may have been connected at one point. And some other fossils that are noteworthy are the Signathus and the Lystrosaurus. So these are just some fossil remains that are notable for proving that the continents were once connected. So, despite all this evidence, people did not accept Alfred Wegener's hypothesis. And the reason why they didn't accept his hypothesis was because he was really unable to prove how this actually happened. What was the mechanism behind the continents actually moving? He proposed that simply the continents push apart, and he couldn't really give a explanation as to how. So that's why people rejected his hypothesis, and he actually died before his hypothesis was ever accepted. So there were several other people that carried on his hypothesis and attempted to gather more evidence to try to prove it. One of the really important figures in the continental drift theory was Henry Hess. He was a geology professor and was a naval officer during World War II. And while he was on his naval ship, he used a technology called sonar, which is basically using sound waves to discover what's underneath the ocean. He was using that to try to discover German naval ships. And he actually discovered on accident these huge mountain ranges under the water, and that caused him to investigate further. And after a lot of research that extended after the war, he concluded that there was something called seafloor spreading under the water that actually helps prove that continental drift is actually happening. So let's take a look at what seafloor spreading is. So seafloor spreading is an idea that happens at what we call mid-ocean ridges. So here's a mid-ocean ridge, and if you guys remember from the last lesson, we learned that there are divergent boundaries, so when two plates are moving away from each other. And mid-ocean ridges are in the middle of the ocean, and they are formed by two divergent boundaries. There's convection under the Earth's crust in the mantle, and that's causing these divergent boundaries to spread apart, as you can see in this diagram. Now, magma will push out of the mid-ocean ridge, the little gap in between the two boundaries, and it will form new crust. In this diagram, you can see how as you move away from where the ridge is, you get older and older crust. So when the magma comes out, it bubbles on the surface, and the newest magma or the newest crust is actually right next to the ridge, and the older crust gets pushed away from the ridge as this occurs. And this is called seafloor spreading, and this is what's causing some continents to kind of spread apart from each other, because as the magma pushes the crust out opposite from each other, it actually pushes away the continental crust that's sitting alongside this ridge. And the most famous example of this happening is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is right here between North, South America, and Africa and Europe. And here you can see the red is where there's new crust forming, and this plate is moving in this direction, and this plate is moving in this direction, and it's happening because of seafloor spreading. So one question that arises from talking about seafloor spreading is the question of why Earth is not expanding from this phenomenon called seafloor spreading. So in the last slide, we talked about how there is new crust being formed at these divergent boundaries, and I talked about this mid-Atlantic ridge right here, and you can see in this map, wherever you see red, that's actually where there's new crust being formed from a divergent boundary from seafloor spreading. And so if all this new crust is being formed, how come it's how come the Earth is not getting bigger? And the answer to that question is that as new crust is being formed at these divergent boundaries, some crust is actually being destroyed at convergent boundaries, and they're located at various locations. Here is one convergent boundary here that's very, very important to know about. And in this location, we have what we call subduction. And as a reminder, subduction is when one plate will slide under the other plate because it's denser. So here is subduction. We have the oceanic crust kind of sliding under the continental crust because it's denser, and it forms what we call a trench. A trench is a very deep canyon formed in the ocean. And here's a side view of a trench. And it's like a big canyon, and what's happening is it's forming because the oceanic crust is sliding under the continental crust. And so that explains why, although we have new crust forming at these divergent boundaries from seafloor spreading, the Earth is not expanding because the old crust is being destroyed by subduction at these trenches. Now let's go back to more evidence that proves continental drift. So another line of evidence that scientists discovered was looking at Earth's magnetic field and its characteristics in the rocks found along the mid-Atlantic ridge. So what scientists did is they studied the rocks formed at the mid-ocean ridges. And as a reminder, the mid-ocean ridge is a divergent boundary, and magma flows out of the divergent boundary, and it pushes these plates in opposite directions. And if there's continents on either side, it's going to push the continents away. But anyway, they studied the rocks alongside, and they discovered that the rocks had a lot of iron in them. And iron is a metal, and because it's a metal, it responds to Earth's magnetic field. And here's a picture of the magnetic field. We have a north and a south pole. And the iron is going to point in the north direction in the rocks. And they noticed that by studying this, they've noticed that there are a striped pattern along the mid-ocean ridge. And the reason why there's a striped pattern is because every 500,000 years, the Earth has been reversing its polarity, meaning that the north and south poles flip. And because of that, the iron in these rocks are actually also flipping direction. And so here, this might be flipping north, facing north in this direction, but these will be facing north the other direction, and this will be flipped again, and this will be flipped again. And basically, because the same pattern can be formed on either side of the mid-ocean ridge, it helps prove that the new crust is forming evenly on either side, and that it's pushing the plates in opposite directions. And that helps prove that continental drift is happening. Finally, let's talk about the location of earthquakes and volcanoes and how it proves that continental drift happened. And so back in the day, scientists mapped the locations of volcanoes and earthquakes and discovered that there was a really common area that they occurred, and that we call that the Ring of Fire today. And this really helped prove the location of the plate boundaries that we know today. And this is a modern day map of the plate boundaries, but this really didn't get developed until the 1960s. And before that, we really didn't know the direction that plates moved or the direction in which continents moved. And so finally, after gathering lots of evidence, we were able to construct a map. And now today we are able to make predictions for the direction of continental movement as well as plate movement. But mapping the location of earthquakes and volcanoes also helped kind of shape this map and prove that continental drift was happening.